Good morning. Welcome to our class together again. Today we're looking at a passage in 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 7 to 12 in a lesson called the Sojourner Life. If someone were to describe you based upon what they see from you, what would they say about you? Now, I think that's a hard question because most of us are very poor judges of who we really are. We think we're different than we are, and we tend to make ourselves better than perhaps we are. Puts some problems to it. Some put themselves down, some elevate themselves up. But the question the Christian constantly has to ask is what the world around them is seeing. If our hope is to bring Christ to the lives of the world, the only door they seem to be able to get into, the first entry gate into that message, is going to come through us and what we do. Are we barriers to their responding to the gospel because of what they see in us? And how do we show the distinctive Christian character that pilgrims passing through this world should have? If we look the same as the world does, how can we proclaim that we're any different? And that's the key idea for Peter in this book. Before we get to the lesson today, let's stop and take stock of where we are in this letter. Let's kind of follow the breadcrumbs we've left along the way to guide us through the book and know where we've been and where we're going. Peter's driving point is brought up early in chapter 2 where he says, "Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh which war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God in the day of visitation." Peter says we are spiritual exiles who live in this world, and that world is at best dismissive, and at worst it wants to banish anything that has to do with the gospel. And the pressures that we feel force us to embrace the fact that we have to be a distinctively different people who live this way despite our personal circumstances. These people were oppressed by their rulers, but had to submit, as did slaves with masters, or wives with unbelieving husbands. So Peter begins this first section to close by asking a question: what does a sojourner and his life look like? But let's start with a word to husbands. See, before we jump into that question, we need to pick up in verse 7, which is really kind of part of the previous discussion. And we know that Peter uses the same word he used with the wives. He begins this by saying likewise. Peter doesn't give instructions to wives and lets husbands escape scot-free. The age in which I grew up in had a strange idea. I had heard sermons all my life about wives submitting their husbands, but there was very little balance, if any, on how husbands treated their wives. Hand-selected scriptures tended to ensure that husbands did not have to squirm on the pews as the preacher gave instructions. That was for wives. A wife was to submit, and the implicit understanding was that men went off to work, provided for the family, brought home a paycheck, brought home the bacon, and if they did that, they were fulfilling God's role for him. He could then come home, play king of the castle, while his wife served him as a submissive servant. That was the cultural picture that I grew up in the church. But that has not been and never will be the picture the New Testament paints of a husband. Instead, laid upon their shoulders a heavier responsibility. If you listen to Peter, a godly husband recognizes 4 things about his wife. He first of all recognizes her needs. Peter says, likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way. He uses the phrase understanding, and it's more than just knowing who his wife is. It's more than knowing her name, it's more than knowing what her birthday is or what their anniversary is. The 3 things that our husbands have trouble with. Instead, this is a word that describes a complete understanding of someone, the understanding of a wife's physical, spiritual, and emotional needs. It is a close relationship that comes closer because of what you're aware of in a wife. A husband who is living the way he should knows more and more, is more aware than he has ever been every day of what his wife really does need and what she really is. A husband who understands his wife both understands and appreciates her. But the second thing he recognizes is her value. Peter talks about the wife as a weaker vessel. Now don't twist this into Peter saying that the wife is inferior, because it's not about status, but she's physically not as strong as her husband. This is a word that refers to like a delicate vase that has great value to it. If you go to the Neiman Marcus catalog, it has in it a wonderfully exquisite baccarat vase. It's beautiful, it's elegant, and it's expensive. You would pay $42,000 for this piece of crystal. It's not exactly the kind of thing you toss around in the house like a football. It has a lot of worth to it. That's what Peter is trying to say about what a husband does. He recognizes that his wife, being the weaker vessel, also has great value at the same time. He honors her as the weaker vessel. He gives her that kind of esteem. I think one of the more practical reflections on this verse is that a man should never get physical with his wife. There is no circumstance ever that allows a husband to do that. That kind of behavior is not only unsavory, but ignores his wife's nature and her value. I think tragically there are too many husbands who create damage to their wives and their own lives by ignoring the basic fact that God wants us to recognize. To care for your wife as you would a very delicate and expensive vase. The third thing he does, though, is he recognizes her spiritual value alongside of him. This verse also reveals something else. A husband needs to see her spiritual status as the same as his. Far from being inferior, she shares something. What Peter calls it is she's an equal partner in inheritance. And while the Romans kind of lowered the standard for women, God took them and he raised them up. He put them on the same level as men. As we read in Ephesians, in Christ, there's no male or female. When it comes to how God sees you as a Christian and as a person. A godly husband recognizes the same Christ that died for him, died for his wife. Both have been cleansed, and neither is less valuable. But the last thing he recognizes is the impact his relationship with his wife has on his own spiritual life. Paul ends the discussion with husbands with the phrase, that your prayers may not be hindered. A man's spiritual life and vitality depend directly on how he treats his wife. The word Peter uses is a common one in the New Testament, and you've experienced it if you're moving through traffic and slowly getting on. Suddenly a car swerves in front of you and they cut you off, and you have to come to a halt because of that action. He says that's what happens when you don't treat your wife correctly. That cuts off your prayers. It cuts in front of you and stops any progress from them. If a man has spiritual issues in his life, he might want to start looking at his home. How are you treating your wife? Does he value her, cherish her, care for her, appreciate what she needs? If not, this will cut off his spiritual life. Now, out of this verse, I think, comes a profound spiritual truth. Prayer complements behavior, but it will not compete with it. God can shut his ears to your prayers if you don't mind you and your family and get those things straight before you start praying, because it becomes a barrier at that point. So Peter comes to that break point. He's spoken of the various social relationships, that Christians face while living as pilgrims in a strange land. They were citizens of a country, but they had to give allegiance and obedience due the rulers. Slaves obeyed masters, knowing that it was God was the ultimate master, not their earthly master. Wives lived under the authority of their husbands, knowing that her godly character shouted better than a nagging voice ever could speak. And husbands would cherish their wives, building both his spiritual life and hers by treating her with honor and value. And now Peter wraps up this first section. He starts verse 8 with the word finally, or at the end. And he's trying to tie a lot of loose ends together. So what does this sojourner life look like? In it, he lists 9 different traits. 5 are related to how we think and feel inside. But the last 4 are the results of that thinking. These 9 attributes betray what kind of impact you may or may not have on an indifferent or hostile culture. What kind of lifestyle shows you're a sojourner in a strange land? Starts by this list by saying, finally, all of you have the unity of mind. The first trait is like-mindedness. And he starts with a word that really just means unity of the mind. And like-mindedness forms the bonds of fellowship of God's people. Now, some want to always think otherwise. Yet it's easy to misunderstand the concept of like-mindedness. There are some who demand uniformity. Everybody acts exactly the same way and exactly the same time. They do all this in lockstep and no one gets out of line. No one has an opinion. This is how it is. Don't depart from that. That's not what it is. Neither is it unanimity in which we all agree with something that we may privately not agree with. Instead, I think this is a word that you need to see through the filter of 2 different realms. One is the realm of music. Now in music, everyone can sing unison. And that gives the tone, but it's pretty monotonous sound. But when you add different parts, the tenor, the bass, the alto, the sound grows rich and full. You know, we experience that when we sing a song like Love One Another. When all those parts get added one at a time, and you begin to see what happens when you have this like-mindedness rather than this uniformity. But I think the second comes out of an illustration from the Army. William ONeill enlisted in the Army in 1939. He was sent to Fort Hood, Texas to supposedly learn how to shoot an anti-aircraft gun. The problem was, because the United States was not at war at that time, it was also cheap. They didn't buy many weapons, and so at Fort Hood there was a single anti-aircraft gun with several gunners who had to practice. And so ONeill could only practice about once every 2 weeks. But the Army did not tolerate idleness. If you weren't going to fire the gun, you were going to be marching with other soldiers in step endlessly, up and down, back and forth drill fields. And every soldier thought this idle and fruitless exercise was to only demonstrate dominance over the enlisted soldier. And ONeill recognized something else, that in the age of machine guns, no one in their right mind would put everybody in rank and march them in rank file through a battle line, because they'd just be mowed down. It would be sheer suicide for the people to do that. But it wasn't until he was shipped to Europe as the Second World War began that he realized the reason the marching was so important. When you stay in step long enough and you march beside men day after day, pace to pace, together, you learn to care for them. And when you find yourself in battle, the men that you marched with are the men you will defend with your own life. And that's why you march together. That's what like-mindedness does for God's people. The second trait that marks the sojourner's life is the concept of sympathy. Now, Peter goes and uses that word, and we tend to hear that word as dealing only with grief. But the essential character of sympathy is kind of the sum of its parts. It tells its own story. You feel the pain with someone. That's the sum of the parts, with pain. When someone's elated, you feel just as happy as they are. That means you're sympathetic. Or as Joseph Swain wrote in his song, "How Sweet, How Heavenly," he said, "When each can feel his brother's sigh, and with him bear a part, when sorrow flows from eye to eye, and joy from heart to heart." That's what is sympathy. As a group of Christians, we feel what others feel, joy and sorrow, suffering and relief. And without it, we are not together. And without it, we are not one. Then Peter goes on to describe the trait of brotherly love. It's the word from which we get the city of brotherly love, Philadelphia. That's the name. The love of brethren. It's a sense of compassion, companionship, of kinship that cares and defends one another. It's like sympathy, but it's more the tie that binds. I know that siblings have kind of strange relationships at times. They can fight like cats and dogs, but they will be fiercely defensive of the other sibling if he is attacked from the outside. In short, it's been put like this: I can pick on my brother, but don't you pick on my brother. I'll fight for you. I'll fight for him. When we feel that way toward each other, we start looking out for the needs of each other. And people notice and wonder, especially in a world which takes care of itself, how do they care so deeply for each other? I don't have anybody like that. It's an amazing question for people to ask. Peter moves on to tenderhearted compassion. There's this lovely word, tenderhearted, that comes next on Peter's list. Are you tenderhearted? Many are not. They look for faults in others. I've known preachers who call themselves fruit inspectors. It's a coy way of saying, I want to find all the wrong I can find in people. Every wrong idea, every wrong act, I'm superior to them, and I'll tell them where they're wrong. And they'll use any means necessary to put people down. But you see, a tender-hearted person is different. They look at different things. Do you look at the intent of a person rather than just the outcome? Many, including you and I, don't always live the way we expected to live, and we fail and we falter. Are you the kind of person who gives people slack, even when they're not perfect? Even when they don't live up to our own personal standards of what Christianity are? Those things are things that we all carry. We all have a picture of what a Christian's supposed to be, and if you don't live up to them, then you must not be committed. That's the words. See, a tender-hearted person doesn't have his own personal view of what others ought to be like. Do we want others to see what our hearts had that our lives fall short of? Many times the heart has great intentions that the life just doesn't fulfill. And it needs a little help. It needs a tender-hearted person to come alongside and help them. And the only way to become redemptive is to have that same tender-hearted compassion that Jesus had. When he met the woman caught in adultery in John, or he came back to the beach with Peter, who had denied him so badly, and sat and ate and restored him, he never gave up on those people. He always lifted them back and put them back where they ought to be. He was tender-hearted, compassionate. Are you? And then the final of the internal traits that Peter describes is having a humble mind. Few people are genuinely humble. In fact, if they tell you how humble they are, they're betraying that they're not humble. For a humble man never believes he's humble. He never tells you. He just shows it. It's kind of a strange paradox that if you ask someone if they're humble and they say yes, they're not. If they say no, they probably are. In a me-first world, the humble man doesn't push to the front. He relishes in the success of other people, even when his own are forgotten. He wants it to go right, not his way. He remembers that he's not extraordinary, but he's only a creation of God himself, as is everybody else. He waits for God to give the accolades, and even if he's forgotten by men, he's fine. He doesn't put others down to raise himself up. And he's not harsh to prove how important his position is or what his superior intellect is. Humble-minded man is many times passed over and ignored by men, but he's always noticed by God. So how do these 5 traits come out in life? What kind of responses in life do they make? The first response of this kind of character is a forgiving spirit. And it's expressed when things go wrong. Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 9, do not repay evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on contrary, bless, for this you were called, that you may obtain a blessing. First Peter's audience, this was not theory, this was practicality. They were facing daily ridicule from others. They were beginning to face the fierce fires of persecution, harsh treatments. They were shunned, accused, demeaned, sometimes daily. It was only going to get worse. So what do you do when someone treats you unfairly? When you don't deserve what they just said to you? When even you don't believe that they're worth living, then they're not worth giving time for. Do you fire back? Do you shoot them down? Do you take the insult and hurl it back to them with a little bit more poison added to the barb when you throw it? You throw a brick through a storefront window just simply because you're mad at them? See, any fool can express rage, but it takes great character to dust himself off and walk away. Peter says that when reviled, the best response may be, may God bless you, and mean it. Then you will find the blessings that come from forgiveness. Because you see, the natural response of all human beings is when you're hurt, you hurt back. In fact, there's one wise saying that says, hurt people hurt people. It is said that forgiveness is the bridge over which we all must cross. And while we may be victims, we've all inflicted something on other people. Stop the cycle of tit for tat. If someone says something you disagree with on Facebook, don't pound out your disgust on a keyboard. Don't demean. Instead, silently bless the person and let it go. Who's more blessed by that action? The second response of character is a controlled tongue, and then a pure life, and then a peaceful disposition. Peter makes his point by returning to the Psalms and quoting Psalm 34, 12 through 16. In it, he shows these 3 different responses all boiled into one. For whoever desires to live life and see good days, let him keep his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit. Let him turn away from evil and do good. Let him seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. Peter says we keep our tongue from evil. That's a word that means, in our vernacular, stop the trash talk. What do you say when you open your mouth or post on a social media site? Is it something you need to stop? I remember every once in a while I give lectures to young men in preacher training schools about how to get a job. And one of my points is very simple. You folks need to go and clean up your social media feeds. A lot of them show how angry you are or how bitter you are. And I said, you need to get that stuff off. And if you can't say something positive, don't say anything at all. But the second triad is the purity of life. A life that turns away evil and recognizes that the world's pattern is not the same as God's pattern. You see, a pure life seeks to do good, to build up, to advance what is proper and what is positive. A pure life doesn't make personal attacks on people you disagree with. They turn their face from that and they do something good for them. The third trait is someone who wants peace to reign. That means instead of stirring conflict, Christians will do anything in their power to calm the waters. Today's media, and I mean all media, including your favorite channel, your favorite news program, your favorite news feed, has discovered that if they can make you angry enough, you'll stay engaged with that anger and you'll give them more time and attention than any of them are really worth. And so they'll share some ugly post most of the time without much truth attached to it. And it becomes a little poison that you take and it becomes almost a lethal dose over and over again. Is that what someone who pursues peace does? Do they want to hurt someone? Hunt them down? Do they want to hunt down peace and find the best way to solve the problem? In all of this lesson, Peter's driving home a single idea. When Christians live in this world, he wants their attitudes and their behaviors to evoke a response that says, "You're not from around here, are you?" We're supposed to be different, and it's supposed to show. When I was growing up, we lived in Santa Fe, New Mexico, but my mother was from West Texas, Big Spring to be exact. And I discovered through my life that the farther you go in West Texas, the rounder your mouth becomes when you say the word hi. Hi becomes hi. And my mother, I remember, would take me to the pediatrician's office and with me, and she used with her regular Texas drawl and say, hi. And the woman on the other side would always say, would you say that again? Because it sounded so different that she wanted to keep hearing it. That's what we need to do when our culture encounters us. I wonder whether they want to see more of us or less of us because of the spiritual accent we bring with us. Are they not looking for something better than they have? And why does all this matter? Why does everything that Peter has to say in this lesson make any difference? Oh, it's nice things. It'd be good to do. We could say that, I suppose. But I want you to think about something. If you study through the history of the church through the centuries, one cannot escape a single thought. Over time, consistently, culture influences Christians more than Christians influence culture. For instance, in the 2nd century, the church's organizational structure was shifting and changing, and it looked more like Roman hierarchy than it did the simple concept of elders and deacons of the New Testament, and would only become worse with more hierarchy and one big guy at the top. I fear that in some ways, the general way of becoming more like culture, not less like it, we're headed down the same road. We've embraced technology, which is a great blessing when used well. After all, that's what I'm using today to teach you. But when I read various things on the internet, whether it be Facebook or Twitter or some news site, and I see Christians that I know post with the same venom as those who are not Christians, you have to start asking a simple question. Who are we? Are we like everyone else? Is that how we're going to act? Is this what our lifestyle is? Is whatever the world dictates, that's how we will do it too? You see, that's the mirror that Peter holds up in front of us and says, I want you to look and see what face you see in that mirror. Is it the mirror of the world that you're becoming like, or is it the mirror of someone who is so distinct and so different from the world that they cannot help but notice how different you are? So ask yourself the question, are we people who seek to calm others, or we just enjoy a good fight? Are we people who have this compulsive need to tell someone off that we disagree with? Are we people who resort to name calling and character assassination because that's what all of our friends do? Are we people who look very different than others except on Sunday mornings? I think it's vital to hear Peter's imploring cry. Because if we look too much like this world, we cannot persuade it to live for God's world. So we need to look inside of our bags and say, are we living the sojourner's life? Or have we unpacked our bags, settled into this world, and are getting too comfortable with it? We can be pilgrims in a strange land, showing our true allegiance of who we are and who we serve, or we can sink to the level of our world. The choice is ours. Thank you for joining me today. It was a pleasure being with you today. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you again next Sunday.